The revolution will not be televised.
Bonjour, my name is Catherine Vincent. I'm a journalist at Le Monde. We are going to spend 1 hour with the Australian researcher Glenn Albrecht, who is studying in a very peculiar way how we should modify our relationships with nature to stop destroying it. I'll discuss with him during about 20 minutes. Then it will be up to you, internals users, to ask your questions, which will be moderated by Odile Deplat, journalist at We Love Green. Researcher Glenn Albrecht was professor of sustainable development at the University of Murdoch in Western Australia, before working at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. His latest book was published in French earlier this year under the title Earth Emotions, New Words for a New World. He will evoke these words for us that he created and explain why he doesn't believe in the concept of ecological resilience. Hello, Glenn. And thank you.
It's good to be with you.
Thanks a lot to be with us today. You've been living for several years in New South Wales. In this area, located in east of Australia, huge fires occurred from last September to the beginning of March, caused billions of deaths among living beings. To reduce this kind of ecological disaster, like many others, you think that resilience is an illusion. Why do you mean by that word, and why do you believe it cannot be a solution?
It's a very complex issue, and one that I hope we can cover in the time that we have available. I understand resilience to mean if we're dealing with a complex system, and that might be an ecological system or a social system, if it's resilient, it has the ability to quickly or slowly return or bounce back to a previous state that was considered to be desirable. In ecology, I think we tend to think that a desirable ecosystem is one that is complex and diverse. In the social context, that's mainly where I have trouble with the concept of resilience, because I feel that the concept of resilience is becoming or is being appropriated by forces that wish to use it to perpetuate a system that is inherently undesirable. And so a good example of resilience and to bounce back into a state that was desirable would be when you get sick. For example, the COVID-19 issue is one where we've got hundreds of thousands of people that have got sick and then have recovered, and they may not bounce back quickly to health, but they do return to health, we hope, in a period of time. An example of perverse resilience, or resilience which is undesirable, is where we have a situation, for example, the Australian government is keen to return Australia to its state prior to the bushfires that you mentioned in your introduction. They were horrendous, and the scientific consensus is that the bushfires were exacerbated, if not caused, by climate change in Australia, which is now delivering intense heat waves, prolonged drought, and they're the conditions that generate fire. The prolonged drought, the heat, is considered to be directly or indirectly connected to global warming or climate change. And so the government policy of wanting us to return to an economy that was just like the one before the fires, carbon intensive, Australia's famous for its coal exports, we're exploiting gas as much as we can. That's precisely the kind of bounce back that we don't want. It's going to lead to more fires and disaster. So good resilience is a state in the future that enables us to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change or pandemics of disease that are related to environmental disturbance. Bad resilience or perverse resilience is a form of resilience that actually gives us back the state that we're trying to get out of. And so we need to make this distinction, because politics is quite capable of twisting and turning the meaning of words in a way that is far removed from their original intention. So in Australia, we talk about snap back after the COVID epidemic is over, and we're going to snap back to the state of the earth and the state of Australia exactly as it was before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Donald Trump and his administration wants America to not talk about climate change, but to talk about how resilient the USA is to the impacts of climate change. So climate change is removed from public language, and resilience is put in. And so the politics of resilience are the thing that I'm concerned about, not so much how ecologists use the term.
Okay. Thank you for this first answer, Glenn, and we'll see later what is the good resilience in more details. But before that, I want you to tell us, please, about solastalgia. You are known for having invented this concept of solastalgia. What does that word mean in your mind? And could you explain when and why did you create it?
Yes, solastalgia was created by me in 2003. And the reason I created it was to try and make sense of the emotional responses that people in my region in New South Wales were having to the expansion of open cut or open cast coal mining in a very large area of the Hunter region. The term means it's an emotional response. It's a form of distress that people feel when they see change, environmental change happening around them of a type that they have no control over, and they feel powerless to prevent it. The people that I were looking at and researching were rural folk who were being affected by this black coal mining over hundreds of square kilometres. In addition, there were major power stations in the area, so the coal industry was having a massive impact on their quality of life. So it seemed to me that we had no word in the English language to describe this kind of distress. So rather than put eco in front of distress, I decided that it was such an important condition that we needed a new word in English to try and describe it. The word that was used in English that came closest to it was the concept of nostalgia, which in its traditional meaning meant a form of melancholia or homesickness that people felt when they were absent from home and wished to return. My people in the Upper Hunter were at home, but their home environment was in a sense leaving them. It was changing in a way that they found was very negative, undesirable. And so when we think about it, these kinds of changes are occurring to people all over the world. Development, climate change, mining in its various forms, intensive farming. You know, a mega chicken farm can have the same kind of impact on the surrounding people as a coal mine. And so the word solastalgia is the homesickness you have when you're still at home and your home environment is changing around you in ways that you feel are entirely negative. So the reason for creating is that the people I were researching had an intense love of the place where they lived. The geographer Tuan called it topophilia, love of place. And if you have a love of place and it's being desolated or destroyed, then quite clearly you can have an emotional reaction to that. And that's what solastalgia attempts to convey. It's the negative emotion when your loved home environment is being desolated or devastated right before your very eyes. It's a lived experience of that destruction and that desolation.
It's a negative emotion which can be useful. So, Glenn, there is solastalgia, but it's not the only word that you invented. You have created many words, many terms, which can be found in your book, Earth Emotions, New Worlds for a New World. The title is very clear. And you believe that it's important to nominate more precisely our relations with the planet, with negative or positive emotions and feelings, For what reasons do you think it's important to have these new worlds?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately for me, I had to deal with the English language when confronting this emotional distress that I discovered in the people of the Hunter region of New South Wales. It also, you wouldn't be surprised to learn, resides within me. When I see a loved home environment being destroyed, I have an emotional reaction to it. And it surprised me that I didn't have a word for that reaction, or I didn't even have a close word. It was just something that was missing in my language. The philosopher Wittgenstein once wrote that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And so if my language world is impoverished and is incapable of accurately describing the reality that I see around me, my response as a philosopher is to create new words, because the new words will correspond with something which is happening in the environment or something which is happening external to me. And the other reason why it's so necessary to have these new words is that the world is changing so rapidly. We don't have the conceptual or linguistic apparatus to describe what is going on. And it doesn't matter whether we're Inuit in the Arctic, Indigenous Australians on the continent of Australia, whether we're French or English, we all are facing this problem at the same moment. Our world is changing. The patterns and rhythms that once corresponded to the nuances, the detail of our language, that's either disappearing or changing in ways that humans are finding distressing. And so we now need a new language for this era of collapse or solastalgia, as I call it. We find we're in a situation where reality does not correspond with our language. And my response to that problem is to let's create the language that more accurately describes what it is that we're experiencing and begins to uncover the problems that we have with respect to the relationship between language and the environment. And so to create new language is not to construct a new reality, it's to attempt to describe more accurately the reality that we're currently confronting.
But among these worlds, there is one who could describe a new reality, maybe in future, which is Symbiocène. Symbiocene, in your mind, it's the area of the history of Earth which will succeed if all goes well, the current Anthropocene. Could you please, Glenn, briefly, because time is running, define these two periods for us and explain how there are differences?
Sure. Well, I think since the Industrial Revolution, humans have now taken control of the major systems and patterns and life support systems of the Earth. The Anthropocene is the era of human dominance over all of the life systems, the Earth systems that are currently understood on the Earth. So this period of dominance represents, for me, what is called dysbiosis, or a bad way of life, leading to sickness, death, and extinction. The Anthropocene, for me, is characterized by the breaking of the symbiotic relationships that have helped life evolve over the last 3.5 billion years. So the Symbiocene is the next era in our development as a species. I see it as something which involves the reintegration of humans with the rest of life. The Anthropocene is characterized by the separation of humans from the rest of life. So symbiosis for me represents a good way of living, leading to health and to the celebration of life and all that means. So then we will have genuine resilience. It will be a bounce. It won't be a bounce back to former states that are cancerous. It will be a creative moment or a creative turn in human development that reintegrates humanity with the rest of life. So we can now begin to think about how some of these other concepts like resilience, sustainability, even regeneration, are really easily captured by the current Anthropocene, the human dominant narrative. What I hope is that by creating new terms, by giving us a vision of a new era where our positive earth emotions can be seen to thrive, we actually are critiquing the Anthropocene, we are imagining and envisioning the Symbiocene, and that gives us something to hope for and something to work for. It's going to be a vision of our future, which enables our young people to see something really fantastic for their future, as opposed to the catastrophe which is unfolding under the Anthropocene.
Okay. And to go to this direction, there are some people who can help us, maybe. You are born in Australia, and it was almost natural for you to study the links that Aborigines have built with their environment, and that for tens of thousands of years. And it's a very different way to consider nature. The ethnologist Deborah Bird-Rose, who died recently, knew that subject very well too. And she believed that to deeply change our relation with living beings, we should bet not on fear, but on love. Do you agree with that? And how to learn to love animals and plants?
I do partly agree with Deborah Bird-Rose, who I greatly admire as an academic and as a writer, and I'll explain why it's only partial. Of course, I agree that we learn to love animals and plants, that we need to do this. She argued persuasively that in order to protect something, you need to love it first. You need to be able to have a loving relationship. I also, with her, respect the culture of the Indigenous Australian people. I was born in Noongar country in Perth in Western Australia. I now live on Wonnarua country, which is the tribe and clan of Aboriginal people that lived in my part of New South Wales. And I'm aware that by living on their land, I have a huge respect for their longevity of tenure on the continent of Australia, something like 80,000 years or longer. I think the Australian environment is one where we can have biophilia, or the love of life, but we also need respect and fear. And I'm sure many of your listeners and people who are watching are aware of the jokes about Australia being full of poisonous snakes and spiders. Fear is not something that I see as a negative. I often see fear as a positive affirmation of the reality of the place that you're in. I live on a farm and with bushland where I encounter one of the most poisonous snakes in the world on an almost daily basis during the summer. So I have fear of that snake, and I think that's a good and positive thing. However, the love of life, I think, that Deborah Bird-Rose talks about, has been followed by many thinkers throughout the world. And I think that people like Albert Schweitzer, the philosopher Erich Fromm, E.O. Wilson and others have talked about biophilia, this love of life, which is hopefully ingrained in us as a species, has the opportunity to come out, to blossom, to actually allow our humanity to connect with our positive earth emotions. And so I see the work of people like Deborah Bird-Rose as an affirmation of the value and quality of life. And really, compared to death and destruction and disease and cancer and all the other negatives that can be described as part of the collapse, life stands as a bright light, as something that we can put our hearts and our minds into as a commitment into our future. I've created more of my terms to describe that love of life in my book, and I encourage those that want to learn more about it to dive in further and deeper.
Okay. Thank you very much, Glenn, for all these answers who opened the road. I now give the floor to Odile de Pla, who will take care of your questions.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for the question. The first question is from Arnaud Cacher, and his question is, what degree of resilience are we able to reach for a newborn after collapse? I mean, we need to create experimental refugee areas.
I see what you mean. Yes, the idea of refugia, places where we can go to and maintain that which we value right now. They're incredibly important ideas, and I think at the moment a lot of the refuge ideas are forms of escapism, at least the ones that I'm reading about, people who are trying to buy the whole of New Zealand in order to have an escape from climate change. Little do they know that the shaky islands are also capable of delivering earthquakes as well. But I think a sophisticated idea of a refuge lies behind the idea of conservation. And people like E.O. Wilson have also talked about the need for looking at conserving at least half the earth from the damage and development that is taking place under the great acceleration of the Anthropocene. So I see refuge operating at multiple scales, from the micro to the macro. We can do everything at the micro level in our homes, in our gardens. We can practice organic gardening and permaculture. Our homes are going to have to become more of a refuge anyway. In Australia, we're now facing temperatures in the summer getting close to 50 degrees Celsius, which is at the limit of human endurance. So we're being forced to change in a way that's to adapt to the reality that's unfolding. But at the same time, we have to move rapidly to alleviate those conditions. We can't just allow it to keep getting hotter and drier and more intense. So refuge is what we have as the gift of what's called the Holocene, the period of the geological era of the last 11,000 years, where we had relative stability in the climate and relative stability in the patterns and rhythms of nature. And those are the things that we must protect as much as possible, because they're the things that are going to disrupt our lives to an incredible degree. So I conclude by saying that refuge is important, but change so that a future is viable is even more important.
Thank you. Here's another question from Hannah Waddell. What is the productive capacity of longings, such as solastalgia? Desire and longing are something very human, we share. How can we mobilize it globally rather than seeking refuge in a kind of permanent longing?
Right. Solastalgia can lead to a longing for a future which negates the past. It doesn't look backwards. The word nostalgia does that, and I've created a word which is the opposite in a sense. It's not to return home. It's to return your home to a state which is going to give you solace, to return your home to a state that's going to give you refuge. So in other words, solastalgia is not a negative concept. It's a negative emotion which can lead to a change in the way that you relate to your land, repair, restoration, land care. All of these things are important aspects of solastalgia. If you can see on your screen the condition of the Upper Hunter in just one open cut coal mine, it's that kind of vision that we need to overcome, because it's almost impossible to restore such a degraded landscape. It's almost impossible to conceive of how we can put the Earth's climate back in place if we continue to pump CO2. So the solution to both of these problems, the solastalgia of people in the Upper Hunter and the coal mining leading to carbon dioxide emissions, is exactly the same. We have to stop the coal mining. We have to restore that which is already being damaged. We have to return our Earth to a state that's capable of supporting our lives and the multitude of lives in what we call biodiversity. So the prescription is simple. Our emotional health is tied to the biophysical health of the planet, always has been, and it always will be. My point is to try and make it a good relationship, one of good earth emotions, instead of seeing the age of solastalgia get even worse and last longer. In some respects, my work is to try and get rid of the concept of solastalgia in the English language or in any other language as quickly as possible. So I've created it in order to destroy it.
And I was wondering, it's a personal question, but inspired by the audience, do you think that Greta Thunberg suffers from solastalgia?
I think so, but I would have to have a direct conversation with her. I wouldn't like to anticipate her own moods and emotions, her language as well. She is not a English as first language person. But I think after a good conversation, we would probably come to the conclusion that our responses to what is happening under the chaos of global warming and the impact that it's having on life in general and human life in particular, both our physical well-being and our mental well-being. So that doesn't mean that it's a mental illness, it just means it's a state of mind which we find disturbing. I think we would have a lot in common, and I'm a strong supporter of her right from day one when she was photographed sitting in front of her school. And I support my own grandchildren in their school strike days on Fridays. So I'm pretty sure we have a lot in common.
Maybe if I can join you, because we are talking about Greta Thunberg. I'm thinking about your worlds, Glenn, and you offer these new worlds and a story to approach the coming world, and it's already a lot, but it's not enough, of course. And we need politic, and Greta Thunberg talks about politic. What political direction could you imagine for such a huge aim, and what's the role of young youth in this fight?
Well, I think the role of youth is critical, and in my book, I've created a label, if you like, which I've called Generation Symbiocène, which is the generations that need to confront the generation Anthropocene, which may well be the people in charge at the moment. And being an aging baby boomer, it's probably my generation that needs to be confronted more than any. Generation Symbiocène has the job of converting our failing democracy into what I call symbiocracy, the governance that's needed not just for humans, which is what the demos in democracy means, it's people. The deep ecologists and others have long argued that we need a form of governance for that which is more than human, the rest of life, that which we are connected to. That is what I mean by the symbiology or the symbiocracy. It's the idea that symbios in the Greek means living together. And we live together with life forms from the micro to the macro. They live inside us, they're part of our microbiome. We live in ecosystems, and so we're part of the living processes of trees and other animals. We live on a planet which many would argue is a living planet. And so as a result, our politics being so exclusively confined to the human has to expand and embrace the rest of life. It's that separation from the rest of life that our politics is getting wrong. That's the perverse resilience of the Australian government right now that wants to extract more coal, more gas, in order to make our economy healthy without having any recognition that that's actually going to make the life chances of current and future generations a lot worse than they are. So as a result, the idea of a new politics, I think, is, for me, a continuation of what many environmentalists and green thinking people have been arguing now for at least 5 decades and maybe longer. We need to have a form of governing ourselves, which brings our interests, our concerns and our technology and enterprise interline with the patterns that exist in the rest of life. And as far as we know, there isn't another Earth anywhere handy that we can go to. So we do need to protect, conserve and restore this Earth that we are living on. And I'll leave it to Elon Musk and others to go and live on Mars. Good luck to them. But my love affair is with this Earth. And I'm working as hard as I can to ensure that our politics responds to the urgent distress that the Earth is in right now, and that the politics will be led by generation Symbiocène, which is Greta's generation onwards, those people who have within them the love of life, the biophilia, needed to see that we are not exceptional beings. We have to live with the rest of life, and that a politics of inclusion is our only future. And
some people are interested in space exploration, but Anna asked another question. There is also groups of individuals strongly nostalgic from the industrial past. What with these conflicting, longings?
So nostalgia for the past. Well, I think if, we can fall in love with steam trains, and they're very impressive things when you see them, but they belch out huge amounts of pollution. They run on a fossil fuel, and they're part of an era that I think we need to acknowledge as part of our history and part of our heritage. But we've got to move out of it. We are now, the steam train has been replaced by coal-fired power stations, gas-fired power stations, which are changing the face of the Earth and its climate. So we're no longer looking nostalgically at small things that were part of the early industrial revolution. We're now looking at things that are changing the climate of the Earth. Now, as a result, we've gone from small-scale environmental damage to global-scale environmental damage. This is the great acceleration, what Gosh is called the Great Derangement. We are witnessing through our own development the destruction of our own earthly environment. So as a result, we can feel nostalgic for the past, and it's nice to see the odd steam train go down the tracks. But we are now living in a world where the steam era and the fossil fuels that generate it have reached the end of their useful function. They are now delivering perverse resilience and climate change in a disastrous form. We need to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So we can have a museum for them, and I'm more than happy for them to appear in books, but we shouldn't allow our nostalgia for the past to prevent us from having a viable and vibrant future. And that's exactly what's happening now.
Thank you.
Glenn, I had a question for you, but maybe it's not a good question, in fact. It's a French question.
Right.
The question was, how did you choose your new words between male and female? But in English, the problem is not so important. So maybe the question is, how did you decide for the translation in languages who have these two genders to make male or female words?
Well, I talk about emergent androgynous intelligence. I tried to avoid it that way by saying that both men and women we are bestowed with intelligence in equal amounts, and that our combined intelligence is needed to get us to firstly understand the problem that we're in, and to get us out of it secondly. So yes, in English I don't have the problem of gender referring to the earth or to any other aspect of my work unless I put it in. In my book, I comment on the fact that many of the environmentalists that have impressed me with their work, their understanding of the way the world works, have been women, and they've been roundly criticized by the patriarchy within science and many other areas of human endeavor. So I acknowledge the gendered nature of this, of green issues. But I reject the idea that the Earth is either male or female, or that any of the other issues that we're dealing with, like climate change, have an inherently gendered aspect. They've been made to have one by a society that is culturally and politically patriarchal. That's a problem that we need to overcome culturally and politically. It's not something which is built into the structure of reality.
Thank you. And someone wanted to know, how is the fire situation in Australia right now?
Well, of course, we're in winter, so we hopefully don't have any fires, but we were experiencing fires very late into the summer, and indeed we're still experiencing fires in our autumn. But in a sense, talking about winter and autumn and these things in Australia is almost to avoid the whole issue, because we don't have 4 seasons here. The Aboriginal people used to account for at least 7 different types of seasons, and those seasons are being obliterated by climate change because we are getting hotter at all times of the year. Drought is something which we're now experiencing in long periods, like a 2-year period or 3-year period. So even in the winter we are cold, but if it's dry, things can still burn. So our fire season is no longer a season connected to the calendar. It's a season that occurs when things are dry enough to burn. And so the whole issue of fire is now hopefully being discussed at intense depth in Australia. We have what's called a Royal Commission, a study on what happened in Australia during November, December and January and parts of February between 1919 and 1920. So it's an issue that we are now, 2020 I should have said, we are now looking at what has happened. It's hard because we're still under the COVID-19 restrictions, so people are having to do their commission in a virtual format similar to the one that we're having to do as part of the this green celebration. So it's happening right now. The climate scientists keep telling us that it's going to get hotter and drier unless we urgently move to a carbon neutral state by 2030. So I see it as a tipping point that we're going to have more fires. They're going to get worse unless we change. And yet the perverse resilience of Australian politics is reluctant to make those changes. And I note that the United States of America is in much the same position. So these are things that are intensely political and are just like the Black Lives Matter emotional intensity that we have right now. It's appropriate and proper that we have that intensity right now with respect to that issue. But there is another issue, which is this climate issue, which is affecting the fire risk in Australia. And that's one that affects everyone on Earth and every living species on Earth, every living organism. So I think we, again, hopefully when the investigations and the commission are over, we will be in a position in Australia to say that we are going to turn around the fire risk and go back to a state which is safer, more secure. But it's not going to be the same Australia that we had before these fires. The forests of Eastern Australia are now experiencing a regime change. Our wet forests, our rainforests, many of them are unlikely to ever come back, at least not in the lifetime of myself or my grandchildren. It's going to take thousands of years, assuming we've got on top of the climate change issue.
Glenn, I would like to come back to the youth and the generation problematic. With the fall of ideologies and religions, quite of all, isn't the fight against global warming the new religion for the world's youth? And how the COVID epidemic that we just knew can help to realize this necessity?
Right.
There
Well,
are two questions in one.
in my book, I try to make explicit the idea that our spiritual connection to the earth is central to our being human. How well religions capture that spiritual relationship is highly variable, and many people would argue that, for example, Christianity is a religion that has, over a couple of thousand years, separated humans from the rest of nature, have been partly responsible for the idea that humans are a special and separate creation. There are other religions, or perhaps quasi-religions, that acknowledge a much more integrated vision of the relationship between human beings and other species. I've tried to avoid that issue by saying that we are inherently spiritual beings, but that we don't need organized religion in order to allow that spirituality to be given free rein, to be given its freedom. So I write a chapter in the book that we need a secular spirituality that takes the place formerly occupied by spirituality within religion. Maybe the pagans and early humans had such a secular spirituality. I don't know. I think the Australian Aboriginal people certainly had a spiritual, intensely spiritual relationship to the biophysical environment that they lived in, and they didn't have organized religion. So I'm hoping that what is important within religious ways of thinking is this idea of a spirituality, a non-material affinity or relationship that we have with other human beings and life in general, because life is seen to be so important. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has alerted us to the fact that within humanity, we are, so delicately poised between the conditions of life that support its ongoing strength and vitality and conditions in life that can destroy us, that can bring us down. In a sense, we've been lucky. The pandemic has not been as bad as Spanish flu or American flu of the early 20th century. What we have now is something which we realize we have no cure for, that we can't just take a pill. It's something which reasserts the independence of nature and reality over our lives as humans. And I think that should deliver a form of intense respect for that life. And part of that is to respect the integrity of ecosystem health, for example, that by tearing ecosystems apart, by putting species together that don't normally relate, by eating foods in these so-called wet markets that bring these different species together in a way that can allow viruses, for example, to jump into humans. All of those things are part of the story of our failure to accept the deep integrated spirituality of life. We also do this when we, don't respect agriculture, and that we begin to use things like intensive agriculture in the form of feedlots, where, for example, mad cow disease a few decades ago was a major worry for people throughout the world. We were very close to having a pandemic with that. A disease that affects the brains of humans. We didn't learn from that. We didn't learn from SARS. We haven't really learnt from Ebola or HIV/AIDS with respect to zoonoses or diseases that jump from animals into humans. The reason for that is our failure to materially and spiritually respect the places where the rest of life occupies. And that gets us back to that point of E.O. Wilson and half Earth. If we can't even protect half the Earth from the development of humans, what hope do we have? We need to begin to seriously see the connections between the health of ecosystems and human health, we need to seriously see that that's not just a material connection, it's also a spiritual one, that our affinity with the rest of life is not an external relationship, it's an internal one. If our microbiome is unhappy, if our gut bacteria are being assaulted by dysbiosis, the bad way of living, then what hope do we have not only for our own health, mental and physical, but for the wider planet that will look after us if we look after it.
So does this incredible experience, this huge pandemic, will you inspire you a new world about coronavirus?
Well, I do my best. I attempt to encourage people to see that it's not Gaia or the Earth seeking revenge on humans through this virus. I think, if anything, what it suggests to me is that Homo sapiens needs to become respectful of its own scientific name. Our intelligence should lead us to a complete change in the way that we're relating to this amazing planet that is the home of life. And we happen to be residents or tenants on this planet and enjoying its bounties and its fecundity, its amazing properties, by virtue of the rest of life that supports us, from our guts all the way to the whole planet as a living system. So for me, it's a lifelong educational issue. It's not something that can happen in an instant. In the book, I argue that we need to move rapidly, and I'm not alone in that. The consensus within the science world is that we need to change, not because it's ideologically necessary, politically necessary, or religiously necessary. We need to change because our material existence is at threat, and in turn that threatens everything that it means to be a human. So I'm hopeful that in the tradition of Rachel Carson and thousands of other amazing people in the environmental nature movement, my voice is one that's adding another dimension to the argument, which is that our emotional lives are intimately tied in this story as well. And so Earth Emotions is about the emotions that humans have, both positive and negative, to this story which is unfolding very rapidly within our own lifetimes.
I have a question from the audience. You talk about the power of words and the duty to find new notions to talk about present and future. And what is the role of artists and writers at this moment in time?
I think it's critical because they're always in front of everyone else. They see more clearly what's gone right and what's gone wrong. And they contribute a vision of that in their art in whatever form. And I've been thrilled to see that many artists worldwide have responded to my new words, my new language, in particular the concept of solastalgia, in order to put in front of other human beings that which they would probably prefer to ignore. And so the destructive aspects of the Anthropocene is now one of the things that artists of various sorts are conveying to the public. When it's in a book, you can perhaps close the book and close your eyes and go away. If it's a work of art in front of you, or if it's a piece of music that you're listening to, it's there in a way that you can't ignore, you can't evade it. And that, to me, is one of the most important aspects of art, is that it puts in front of people that which they would normally not want to see. It can do the reverse as well, put in front of people something that they were longing to see, but couldn't. People who live in cities, for example, can't see aspects of of landscapes, of forests, and of places that are rich in biodiversity because they simply geographically remote from those places. And so I see artists as having one of the most important roles in this whole issue of the transition from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene. Anthropocene artists disturb and bother us. Symbiocene artists will hopefully in the near future thrill us with the beauty, complexity, and wonder of life. And our exhibitions won't have to depict the destruction of the earth. They will depict its reconstruction, its rebuilding, its repair. And so there'll be lots for artists to do in that respect.
Thank you.
Glenn, we have a few minutes yet, and I would like to finish with a more personal question,
Sure.
if you allow us. It's a simple question, but maybe the answer is more complicated. How and when did you develop this love and interest for nature?
Well, it is a long answer because it started in my childhood, and it's been with me for my whole life, so that shouldn't surprise you. I grew up as a nature boy in Perth in Western Australia, and it's a lucky place to have been born. It's both isolated and incredibly beautiful at the same time, and its landscape and its wildlife, and particularly its botany, is truly unique in the sense that it's endemic to that part of the world. You can't go anywhere else and experience the same birds, flowers, trees, animals. So it has one of the highest levels of endemism in the whole of the world, and the southwest of WA is recognised as a global biodiversity hotspot. Having grown up there, I never did take it for granted because I had grandparents that taught me the love of nature. My mother matured to be a really amazing botanist, and she worked for many years in one of our parks in Perth as a volunteer guide to help people learn about the amazing botany. And for whatever reason, I've always been fascinated by birds. So I'm a bird person. My whole world revolves around birds. And one of the reasons why I'm at Wallaby Farm in New South Wales is that it's a real hotspot for birds. You know, it's just amazing, the parrots and the amazing bird life that we have here. So the story of my love of nature is one that is, as a child, I was just infatuated with the world around me, and there were aspects of my life that did turn me inward, and I've written about that in my book. So nature was, in some respects, an escape from other things in my childhood world that I didn't particularly enjoy or want. But overwhelmingly, the love of life and the love of nature and having it as part of my life, being immersed in it, is just part of the development of my character. And with a bit of luck, it'll be with me till the moment I die, because I'd love to turn into a Western Australian wildflower, or have a role in the recreation of a karri forest in the southwest of WA, one of the majestic native trees that we have. So it'll be with me till my last breath. And as an educator, as a philosopher, environmentalist, I've tried to convey that love of life, that love of nature to students over a long career teaching in the environmental area. I now am retired, so the way my love of life and nature is being conveyed is through my writing. But I also get the chance to talk to people all over the world in moments like this. So my love of nature, being a nature boy, I haven't really grown up yet. I still feel like I'm a nature boy, even though the beard is grey and parts of me don't function quite as well as they used to. I actually don't feel any different as an adult wandering into a forest and becoming lost with the birds as that feeling I had as a child, doing exactly the same thing and feeling that I was no longer separated from nature, but an integral part of it.
Still so young. So it's a very nice conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Glenn, to have spent this hour with us. And now we are going to go to the next show. Thank you again, Glenn. And
My pleasure. Solophilia to you all.